The alien medical team worked in silence, their bioluminescent eyes flickering with unease. The creature on the operating table should have been dead. Any other species would have been. The damage to its body was severe: burnt flesh, shattered bones, internal bleeding. Yet, somehow, it was still alive. Its chest rose and fell in uneven, stubborn breaths. Dr. Vale, the lead surgeon, hesitated before making the first incision. The thick, red fluid oozing from the wounds was strange. Too thick, too vibrant, clinging stubbornly to the skin as if refusing to leave. Every species they had studied before had predictable reactions to trauma. But this was different. It clung to life with a force that defied reason. The assistants exchanged nervous glances. They had heard stories about this species, humans. Primitive, fragile creatures from a backwater planet, known for their aggression and recklessness. But none of them had seen one up close before. Certainly not like this. This one had been found adrift in the wreckage of a destroyed ship, its body broken beyond repair. No stasis pod, no life support, just empty space and lethal radiation. By all logic, it should have perished hours ago. Dr. Vale pressed a surgical tool against the human's flesh, expecting the usual reaction. The tissue should have resisted, tensed from pain. But instead, something unnatural happened. The wound pulsed. Then slowly, before their very eyes, the edges began to close. Cells fused, muscle fibers reknit. The bleeding slowed. It wasn't healing instantly, but it was healing. Faster than anything they had seen before. One of the assistants recoiled. "That's impossible," he whispered. Dr. Vale didn't respond. His mind raced through possibilities. Was this a biological defense mechanism? A mutation? No, this wasn't an accident. This was something deeper, something written into the very fabric of the human species. And then the human's fingers twitched. The entire room froze. No anesthesia, no sedation, just raw survival. The human's eyes fluttered open, unfocused but alert. A cold chill ran through Dr. Vale. The subject was awake. No creature, no matter how strong, should have been able to endure this much trauma and remain conscious. The human's gaze darted around the room, its breathing quickening. Then, despite the pain, despite the injuries that should have kept it paralyzed, it moved. Fingers curled into a fist, muscles tensed. A low, raspy breath escaped its throat. And in that moment, Dr. Vale felt something he had never experienced before. Fear, because this was no ordinary survivor. This was something else entirely, something their kind was never meant to understand. Dr. Vale stood behind the reinforced observation glass, his bioluminescent eyes dim with unease. The human was still alive. More than that, it was recovering. He had watched its body repair itself in real time, something no species in the known universe could do. Not like this. Not at this speed. The subject sat on the edge of the examination table now, hands clenching and unclenching, as if testing their own strength. Its face was still battered, dark bruises covering one side, a deep gash running along its forehead. Yet, where those wounds should have taken weeks to mend, they were already closing. The alien scientists whispered among themselves, unable to hide their nervous fascination. "This defies logic," one of the assistants murmured. "Cellular regeneration at this level should not be possible without artificial augmentation." Dr. Vale exhaled slowly. "We need to understand it. Begin the tests." A silent command was sent through the observation room's interface. The walls of the containment chamber shimmered as the temperature began to drop. The human flinched as frost formed along the metallic floor beneath its feet. Breath misted in the air, skin turning pale as the chamber plunged into sub-zero temperatures. The scientists watched with clinical detachment, monitoring its vitals. Most species would start shutting down within minutes. The cold would slow their circulation. Their organs would stiffen. But the human, it shivered, nothing more. Dr. Vale leaned forward. He expected to see signs of distress, expected the creature's vitals to falter. Instead, something unexpected happened. The human's trembling slowed. Its breathing steadied. Then, its body temperature, previously dropping, began to rise again. No suit, no external heat source. It was as if the body itself had decided it simply would not succumb. Increase the pressure, Dr. Vale ordered. The room shifted again, artificial gravity amplifying steadily. The force pressing down on the human should have been unbearable. Lesser creatures would have collapsed under their own weight, their bones crushed from the strain. The human staggered, but it didn't fall. Its muscles strained, shaking with exertion, but then they adjusted. The trembling lessened. The breathing slowed again, as if the human had simply decided to adapt. The scientists exchanged uneasy glances. "We've studied thousands of species," one of them said, their voice barely above a whisper. "No one reacts like this. No one adapts like this." Dr. Vale's mind raced with possibilities. Could it be some kind of subconscious evolutionary process, an instinct buried so deep within the human genome that it activated only in moments of extreme duress? He had to know more. Another command was sent. This time, radiation levels in the chamber began to rise. Just a fraction at first, enough to simulate the solar flares that most species feared. Radiation was the universal killer. It did not discriminate. Cells mutated. Organs failed. The human's head tilted upward, as if sensing the invisible threat. At first, nothing happened. Its vitals remained steady. Then, something changed. The human's heart rate accelerated, but not in distress. It was reacting. Fighting. The radiation damage appeared almost immediately in the form of slight cellular decay. Except, within moments, those very cells repaired themselves. The scanners showed rapid regeneration, the DNA strands rewriting themselves faster than the damage could take hold. Dr. Vale's fingers curled tightly against the observation console. This wasn't normal. This wasn't even advanced biology. This was impossible. For the first time, he wondered if they had made a mistake. If studying this creature was not the scientific breakthrough they had hoped for, but an unforgivable risk. Because if humans could survive this, if they could endure anything, then what else were they capable of? The human sat motionless in the center of the containment chamber, his body tense, his breathing controlled. He wasn't sure how long he had been here. Days? Weeks? Time blurred in this sterile, colorless place. There were no windows, no voices except for the distant murmurs of his captors beyond the thick observation glass. They had tested him, again and again. The cold, the pressure, the radiation, each one meant to break him. But he hadn't broken. His body had adapted in ways he didn't fully understand. He should be dead, but he was still here. He was still alive. And that terrified them. He could see it in the way they watched him now, their bioluminescent eyes flickering with unease. The clinical detachment they had started with was gone. The curiosity had turned to something else. Caution. Fear. Good. He clenched his fists, rolling his shoulders, testing his body. The pain had dulled to a low, distant throb. His broken ribs had set themselves days ago. His wounds had sealed. He had no explanation for it, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to wait around for them to find out just how much more he could endure. He had to leave. The door to his chamber slid open with a soft hiss. Not the observation room's sealed exit, just a smaller maintenance hatch where one of the aliens entered cautiously, carrying a tray of what passed for food here. The creature was smaller than the others, its pale, translucent skin shifting with nervous energy. The human didn't move, didn't react. He had learned their habits by now. The way they studied him, the way they never got too close. They feared proximity. He had noticed the way their hands twitched near their waistbands, where he suspected a hidden defense mechanism, some kind of energy-based weapon. That meant if he was going to escape, he had to do it fast. The alien placed the tray on the metal slab that served as his bed. The human waited, silent, calculating. The alien hesitated before stepping back, its bioluminescence pulsing erratically. That was when the human struck. In a single motion, he lunged forward, grabbing the alien's wrist and yanking it forward. The creature let out a high-pitched screech, its other hand darting toward its hidden weapon. But the human was faster. His instincts had always been sharp, but now, after everything they had done to him, they felt enhanced. He twisted the alien's arm behind its back, forcing it to drop the small metallic device it had been reaching for. He scooped it up, barely sparing a glance at its sleek, unfamiliar design. He would figure it out later. Right now, he needed to move. With a single powerful strike, he knocked the alien unconscious and let it slump to the ground. No time to waste. He grabbed the creature's ID badge and scanned it against the nearest panel. The system hesitated for a fraction of a second before the lock disengaged. He stepped out into the hallway. It was eerily quiet. The walls pulsed faintly with a strange organic glow, and the air smelled sterile, artificial. He had expected alarms, shouts of warning. But there was nothing. Either they hadn't noticed him yet, or they were waiting. He moved swiftly, keeping low, listening carefully. His senses felt sharper than ever, picking up the faint hum of machinery, the distant murmur of voices. He followed the corridor, his stolen weapon gripped tightly in his hand. If they thought he was going to sit in that cage and be their experiment forever, they were wrong. He turned a corner and stopped abruptly. 2 guards stood at the far end of the hallway, their strange, elongated weapons pointed in his direction. They were ready for him. But what they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that he was ready for them too. They fired. The air crackled with energy, but the human was already moving. His body reacted before his mind had even processed the danger. He dodged left, rolling across the floor, feeling the heat of the blast graze past his shoulder. He came up fast, raised his stolen weapon, and fired blindly. One of the guards dropped instantly. The other hesitated just a second too long. The human closed the distance, driving his elbow into the alien's torso, sending it crashing against the wall. He grabbed its weapon before it could recover, turning it on the creature. "Where's the exit?" His voice was hoarse, raw from disuse. The alien bared its sharp teeth but said nothing. The human exhaled sharply, pressing the barrel of the weapon against its chest. "I won't ask twice." A long pause. Then, finally, the alien's bioluminescence flickered in what the human was starting to recognize as surrender. It raised a trembling hand and pointed down the corridor. Without another word, the human shoved the alien aside and ran. His heart pounded as he sprinted through the unfamiliar halls, his mind racing. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know how far he had to go. But none of that mattered. He wasn't supposed to survive. But he had. And now he was going to escape. The alarms finally blared to life as the human ran through the alien corridors. Harsh, warbling sirens echoed off the strange metallic walls, the sound vibrating in his skull. The ship was waking up. They knew he was loose now. Good. Let them come. He had spent days, maybe weeks, in their cold, sterile prison, enduring their tests, their experiments. His body had been broken, his mind pushed to the edge. But they had made a mistake. They had underestimated him. And now, their mistake was coming back to haunt them. The stolen weapon in his grip felt awkward, its shape unfamiliar, but he didn't need to understand it completely. He had learned how their technology worked just by watching them. The trigger mechanism was sensitive, designed for creatures with thinner, more delicate fingers. He adjusted his grip and pushed forward. The corridors stretched in every direction, branching off into twisting paths that made no sense to him. The walls pulsed with a strange organic glow, shifting colors in response to the ship's alert. He needed to find an exit, a hangar, an escape pod, something, anything. Footsteps. Not the soft, cautious steps of the smaller scientists. These were heavy, armored. The guards. He ducked into a darkened alcove, pressing his back against the wall as two figures rushed past. They moved with precision, weapons raised, scanning the hallway. He counted their movements, their patterns. They were disciplined, but not expecting an ambush. That was their second mistake. He struck before they even realized he was there. The first guard barely had time to turn before the human's fist crashed into its jaw, sending it sprawling. The second raised its weapon, but he was already on it, driving his shoulder into its chest, knocking it back. It fired, too late. The energy blast shot past his ear, searing the wall behind him. He slammed the stolen weapon against the guard's head, dropping it instantly. The first one groaned, trying to rise. The human grabbed it by the collar and threw it against the wall. Hard. It collapsed in a heap. His breathing was steady, controlled. The old him, the one who had been captured, beaten, experimented on, would have hesitated, would have questioned himself. That man was gone. He pulled a wrist device from one of the guards and tapped the screen. Symbols and alien glyphs flickered to life, unreadable at first, but patterns he could recognize. Navigation, schematics. There, a hangar bay, 2 levels down. He didn't think. He just moved. More footsteps thundered through the halls as he sprinted forward. They were mobilizing now, reacting to the fact that their prey had turned into the predator. The air crackled with energy as weapons fired in his direction. He dropped low, sliding beneath a blast, then rolled behind a corner. His body moved like it knew what to do before his mind had even caught up. That was new. It was more than just survival instincts. This was something else. Something deeper. The tests had done something to him, unlocked something inside him. He should be exhausted. His muscles should be failing, his mind shutting down from the stress. But instead, he felt more alive than ever. Another hallway. Another set of guards. They formed a blockade in front of a sealed blast door, their weapons trained on him the moment he appeared. For a moment, everything was still. Then they opened fire. He reacted instantly, weaving between the bolts of energy, closing the distance before they could adjust. He moved faster than they expected, faster than even he expected. He grabbed the first guard's weapon arm and twisted, feeling the joint snap beneath his grip. The second managed to fire, but the human spun, using the first guard's body as a shield. The blast struck home, dropping its own ally. The third tried to retreat. He didn't let it. With a single motion, he leaped forward, driving his knee into the alien's midsection. It doubled over, and he finished it with an elbow strike to the back of the head. The blast door loomed ahead. No control panel, no manual override, just a seamless wall of reinforced metal. A challenge. He took a step back, inhaled, and clenched his fists. Then he slammed his hand against the door. Metal groaned, dented. He did it again, harder. A hairline crack formed. He gritted his teeth, every muscle in his body surging with raw, unexplainable strength. And then, with one final devastating blow, the door caved in. The human stood there for a moment, breathless, staring at what he had just done. He had never been this strong before. Never been this fast. They had tried to break him. Instead, they had made him more. Beyond the broken doorway, the hangar stretched out before him. Sleek, alien ships lined the walls, their engines humming softly. An open bay door at the far end revealed the black expanse of space. Freedom. But as he took his first step forward, the alarms shifted. The sirens changed pitch, signaling something new. Then he heard it. A deep, guttural growl. From the shadows beyond the hangar, something moved. Something big. The aliens had one last trick up their sleeve, and they had just unleashed it. A deep, guttural growl echoed through the hangar, reverberating off the metallic walls like a warning. The human froze mid-step, his instincts flaring to life. He had spent the last hour tearing through these aliens, adapting to every trick they threw at him. But this was different. From the far end of the hangar, something massive stirred in the shadows. The metal floor vibrated with each step it took. The dim, pulsing glow of the ship's strange lighting system barely outlined the figure, but it was enough for the human to understand one thing. This was no ordinary soldier. It was a hunter. He took a slow breath, gripping the stolen weapon in his hand. He had no idea if this thing could be killed, but he wasn't about to wait and find out. The creature stepped into the light. 7 feet tall, maybe more. Thick, segmented armor covered its body, not the sleek synthetic plating of the guards, but something organic, grown rather than forged. Its elongated head tilted slightly as it studied him, 4 glowing eyes locking onto him with an eerie, unsettling intelligence. This wasn't just some beast. It was sentient. It understood what he was. And it was here to kill him. The human barely had time to react before it moved. It lunged, covering the distance between them faster than something that size had any right to move. He threw himself to the side, rolling just as the floor where he'd been standing exploded under the force of the creature's strike. It was strong, unbelievably strong. He fired. The energy bolt struck the creature's chest, but instead of piercing through, it dispersed across its armor. The force absorbed as if the plating itself was alive. Not good. The creature pivoted, swiping at him with a massive clawed hand. He ducked, barely avoiding having his skull caved in, and countered with a quick, brutal strike to its exposed side. It barely flinched. It lashed out again, and this time, he wasn't fast enough. A solid hit to his midsection sent him flying across the hangar. He slammed into the side of a parked ship, the impact rattling his bones. He gritted his teeth against the pain, forcing himself back up. His vision swam for a moment, but he shook it off. He had been hit harder before. The creature was already closing in. The human exhaled slowly, letting his mind clear. He had faced impossible odds before. He had survived things that should have killed him. He adapted. That was what made him different. That was why they were afraid of him. Time to prove them right. He sprinted forward, dodging the creature's next strike, slipping under its massive arm. Instead of retreating, he did the last thing it expected. He attacked. He drove his fist into the side of its knee, aiming for the joint. This time, it reacted. A low snarl rumbled from its throat as it stumbled, its movements thrown off balance. The human didn't stop. He grabbed a discarded energy blade from the floor, probably dropped by one of the guards he had taken down earlier, and ignited it. The weapon hummed to life, vibrating with contained plasma energy. The creature turned just in time for him to drive the blade deep into the exposed gap between its armored plates. It let out a shriek, more rage than pain, and lashed out wildly. He barely managed to pull back before a massive fist crashed down, shattering the floor where he had been standing. The blade had worked. It hadn't killed it, but it had hurt it, and that meant it could die. The creature charged again, but now he knew its weakness. He ducked low, rolling under its swipe, and drove the blade into another exposed joint, its side, just under the ribs. This time, it staggered. He didn't give it a chance to recover. He twisted the blade and ripped it upward, tearing through muscle and tissue. A thick, dark liquid oozed from the wound, sizzling where it touched the floor. The creature let out one final, ear-splitting roar before collapsing to its knees. The human stood over it, chest heaving, gripping the energy blade tight. The creature met his gaze, those 4 glowing eyes dimming as it let out a slow, rasping breath. And then it went still. Silence filled the hangar. The human exhaled sharply, stepping back. His body ached, his muscles screamed in protest, but he had no time to rest. He turned toward the nearest ship, a sleek-looking craft with an open cockpit. He didn't understand the controls, but that had never stopped him before. He climbed in, scanning the alien interface. Symbols, glyphs. He didn't recognize them, but he recognized patterns. the same way he had adapted to their tests, the same way he had adapted to their weapons, the same way he had survived everything they had thrown at him. His fingers moved instinctively, pressing buttons, flipping switches. The ship rumbled to life beneath him. Outside, he could hear more footsteps approaching. More guards. Too late. He gripped the controls and punched the throttle. The ship roared forward, lifting off the hangar floor. Warning sirens blared as security measures activated, but he was already maneuvering toward the open bay doors. And then, with a final, determined push, he was free. The cold void of space stretched before him, endless and vast. But he wasn't afraid, because he had survived worse. And now he was coming back. And this time, they would be the ones running. The stolen ship shot out of the hangar into the cold abyss of space, its engines roaring as the human gripped the unfamiliar controls. He had no time to appreciate his escape. His pursuers weren't far behind. A warning klaxon blared from the console. He didn't understand the alien symbols flashing across the screen, but he didn't need to. The meaning was clear. Enemy ships were mobilizing. The human glanced over his shoulder. 3 sleek fighter craft emerged from the mothership's docking bays, their engines flaring to life. Their movements were precise, disciplined, predators locking onto their prey. His fingers tightened on the controls. He didn't know how to fly this thing. He had no training, no experience, but that had never stopped him before. The fighters opened fire. Instinct took over. He jerked the controls hard, and the stolen ship rolled violently to the side, narrowly avoiding a stream of blue-hot plasma bolts. The inertia pressed him against his seat, but he fought through it, scanning the controls. The enemy ships were faster, more maneuverable. If he tried to outrun them, they'd cut him down before he reached open space. He needed another plan. His eyes flicked across the console, searching for anything he could use. His brain worked at lightning speed, breaking down the patterns of the symbols. He recognized the energy readouts, the engine diagnostics, the weapons system. There. He jabbed at a cluster of controls. The ship shuddered as its cannons powered up, but before he could fire, another barrage of plasma bolts streaked past his cockpit. One clipped the side of his stolen craft, sending a shower of sparks through the cabin. Warning lights flickered. The ship lurched. His pursuers were closing in. The human gritted his teeth and yanked the controls, forcing the ship into a sharp dive toward the planet below. The gravitational pull of the massive world tugged at the craft, and alarms screamed at him, warning of the rapid descent. He didn't care. The enemy fighters followed, their sleek forms cutting through the void like blades. They had the advantage in speed and firepower. But what they didn't have, what they couldn't have, was his instincts. The human pushed the ship harder, skimming dangerously close to the planet's upper atmosphere. The hull rattled as the heat from re-entry flared along the edges. The enemy ships hesitated for just a moment, just long enough. He pulled up at the last second. The stolen ship screamed as it skimmed the atmosphere, riding the edge of the planet's gravity well. One of the pursuing ships wasn't fast enough. It dipped too low, and in an instant, it was engulfed in flames, ripped apart by the planet's pull. 2 left. They adjusted, learning from their fallen comrade's mistake. They adapted quickly. But so did he. He twisted the controls, angling the ship into a spiraling climb. The G-forces pressed against him, his vision darkening at the edges, but he fought through it. He could feel his body adjusting, compensating in ways it never had before. They had done something to him. The experiments, the torture, whatever they had put him through, it had changed him. He shouldn't be able to withstand this kind of punishment. No human should. But he did. The ship broke free of the planet's gravity well, slingshotting back into open space. The remaining 2 enemy fighters were right behind him, closing in for the kill. He couldn't outfly them forever. His eyes flicked to the weapon controls again. If he could just. A proximity alert blared. Something big was approaching. He turned his head, and his heart clenched. The mothership. It had moved. The aliens had anticipated his escape route, cutting off his path with a massive warship. Its enormous form loomed before him, weapons primed, ready to erase him from existence. Trapped. He had 2 fighters at his back and a battleship in front of him. No way out. Except a slow, grim smile spread across his face. Maybe there was a way. The mothership's shields were still up. He could see the faint shimmer of the energy field surrounding it. That meant they wouldn't risk firing their heavy cannons while their own ships were in pursuit. And the fighters? They were locked onto him, too focused on their prey to realize what was happening. He twisted the ship into a steep climb, directly toward the warship's hull. The fighters followed, their targeting systems locked onto him. He waited until the very last second. Then, with a sharp, calculated flick of the controls, he killed his engines. The stolen ship stalled, and the fighters overshot him. For the briefest moment, the 2 enemy ships were right in the path of the mothership's forward batteries. And in that moment, the human fired his stolen ship's entire payload. The plasma blasts streaked through the void, not at the mothership, but at the fighters. The 2 alien crafts exploded in a blinding flash of energy. And the shockwave. It rippled outward, directly into the mothership's shields. The energy field flared, overloaded from the sudden impact, flickering for just a fraction of a second. A fraction of a second was all he needed. The human re-engaged his engines, punched the throttle, and dove straight toward the mothership's hull. And just before the shield snapped back into place, he slipped through. The stolen ship screamed through the warship's outer defenses, skimming along its armored surface, too close for the massive cannons to target him. The aliens had prepared for him to run. They hadn't prepared for him to come back. He angled the ship toward a docking bay, his mind racing. Escape wasn't enough. Not anymore. They had taken him, tortured him, experimented on him. And now he was going to end this. For good. The stolen ship barreled toward the docking bay, its hull scraped and battered, but still holding together. The human gritted his teeth, fingers tight on the controls. His plan was reckless, dangerous, probably suicidal. But that had never stopped him before. He forced the ship into a steep dive, angling it toward an open hangar on the mothership's underbelly. Warning sirens blared across the massive warship structure, and automated turrets pivoted toward him, spitting streams of plasma fire. He jerked the controls hard, rolling the ship to avoid the incoming blasts. Energy beams sizzled past his cockpit, one clipping the ship's wing, sending a jolt through the entire frame. Alarms flashed on his console, hull integrity failing. The stolen ship wasn't going to hold together much longer. Didn't matter. The docking bay was just ahead. With a final burst of speed, he crashed through the hangar's energy barrier, the ship's failing engines roaring one last time before it slammed into the deck. Metal screeched. Sparks erupted in all directions. The ship skidded across the hangar floor, tearing through supply crates and maintenance equipment before finally coming to a shuddering halt. For a moment, there was silence. Then movement. The human wrenched the cockpit open and leaped out just as a squad of alien soldiers rushed toward the wreckage, weapons drawn. They were fast, disciplined, but he was faster. He hit the ground running, rolling under the first plasma blast and launching himself at the nearest guard. His fist met the alien's throat with a sickening crunch. Before the body hit the floor, he had already grabbed its weapon and fired, dropping 2 more soldiers in rapid succession. The rest hesitated. They had seen what he could do, but hesitation wasn't survival. He tore through them like a storm, dodging, weaving, striking with brutal precision. Every move was instinct, every step calculated. He wasn't just fighting, he was adapting. By the time the last soldier fell, the human barely spared them a glance. His focus was already elsewhere. The core. The mothership's main power core was deep within the ship, but he had spent enough time in captivity to learn its layout. He had memorized every corridor, every security checkpoint. He knew exactly where he was going, and he knew how to bring this entire ship down. He sprinted through the hallways, his stolen weapon held tight. The ship's interior pulsed with alien energy, sleek metallic walls lined with glowing glyphs that shifted as he passed. More guards rushed to intercept him, but they were too slow. Plasma bolts streaked through the air. He dodged most, tanked the few that grazed him, and kept moving. Pain was irrelevant. Stopping was not an option. An explosion rocked the corridor ahead as he fired at a power conduit, sending arcs of electricity spraying through the passage. The emergency lighting flickered. The ship's automated defenses sputtered, trying to adjust. He was throwing everything into chaos, and chaos was his weapon. He reached the core chamber's entrance. Two massive armored guards flanked the doorway, twice the size of normal soldiers, their bioengineered forms bristling with weapons, a final obstacle. They moved as one, charging toward him, their steps making the floor tremble. The human exhaled. His body ached, his muscles screamed for rest, but he ignored it. He had one shot. He sprinted forward, closing the distance faster than they expected. One raised a massive fist to strike, too late. He dove under the swing, sliding between its legs, and came up behind it. The second guard adjusted, pivoting to fire. He was already moving. He grabbed a fallen energy blade from the floor, its plasma edge flickering weakly, and drove it upward, straight into the first guard's exposed neck joint. The alien let out a strangled roar before collapsing. The second lunged, swinging a heavy plasma blade of its own. He ducked, barely avoiding the searing edge, then twisted, grabbing the fallen guard's weapon. The two clashed, weapons colliding in bursts of blue light. The alien was stronger, heavier, but he was faster. A feint, a sidestep, a counter. And then, the final strike. His blade cut through the alien's torso, carving deep into its plated armor. The creature staggered, its growl turning into a gurgle before it collapsed. Silence. The human stood there, breathing heavily. Blood, his and theirs, dripped onto the cold floor. And then, slowly, he turned toward the core chamber. The doors hissed open. The room beyond was vast, filled with the deep, pulsing glow of alien energy. The core stood at the center, an enormous construct of spinning rings and crackling power, the heart of the entire warship. The key to ending all of this. He stepped forward, gripping his stolen weapon tight. An alarm blared. The ship knew. The entire crew knew. They were coming. Didn't matter. He raised his weapon and fired. Energy bolts ripped into the core's control systems, sending showers of sparks across the chamber. The pulsing glow flickered wildly, the hum of power turning into a strained, high-pitched whine. He kept firing, kept breaking it. The walls trembled. The floor beneath him shook. The ship was dying. And then, a deafening explosion ripped through the chamber. He was thrown back as the core detonated in a blinding flash of white-hot energy. Heat seared his skin, the force nearly crushing him. For a moment, all he saw was light. Then, nothing. When he opened his eyes, he was falling. The void of space stretched around him, the shattered remains of the mothership scattering in all directions. The explosion had torn the warship apart, leaving only debris and flickering fire in its wake. His suit's emergency systems had kicked in, stabilizing his descent, but he was still plummeting toward the planet below. The atmosphere burned around him. His vision blurred. He had done it. The ship was gone. The nightmare was over. But now he had to survive the fall. The wind howled. The ground rushed toward him. And the human. He grinned. Because this was just another challenge, and he was ready.